discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The Watergate matter, as President Richard Nixon put it, the infamous incident outside the Watergate Hotel of 5 burglars arrested for breaking into Democratic National Convention headquarters before the 1972 election. Unknown at the time, that burglary connected directly to President Nixon. The Senate launched an investigation and passed 2 articles worthy of impeachment at the conclusion, but another investigation started it all. 2 young journalists at the Washington Post, Bernstein and Bob Woodward, pursued the story in the 5 burglars from the outset. The investigative journalism of Bernstein and Bob Woodward proved instrumental in President Richard Nixon's resignation and on the proliferation of anonymous sources in journalism today. However, the rest of their legacy and impact on journalism remains ambiguous. As of May 1, 1972, Nixon held a double-digit lead in the polls. Weeks later, 5 burglars were arrested by D.C. police. The 5 burglars worked for Nixon, most notably former CIA agent James McCord. Other CIA agents Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt led from afar. Regardless, Nixon maintained a healthy distance and lead in the polls, winning the election. 12 days before Nixon's inauguration, the burglars, Liddy and Hunt, appeared in federal court. All 7 were found guilty to charges of conspiracy and wiretapping on January 30. On February 7, Senate voted unanimously to open an investigation into Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal. Thereafter, Nixon asked John Ehrlichman, one of his top-ranking aides, and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to resign. Nixon, no longer able to avoid association with the Watergate scandal, attempted to pass the blame on to other members of his staff. The Senate found that Nixon kept tapes in the Oval Office. In July of 1973, Special Prosecutor for the Watergate scandal, Archibald Cox, subpoenaed the tapes, but Nixon refused to release them. He then asked his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon demanded the same of the Deputy Attorney General, who, like Richardson, resigned. After a year, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon must release the tapes, and in those tapes, Senate found he obstructed justice. Those were the grounds for Nixon's impeachment, that he avoided by resigning on August 8. It's the story of the arduous political game which engrossed a nation and ultimately led to Nixon's resignation. That's how you read it in your textbook, a story of Richard Nixon and his downfall. However, that's not the story we're focusing on. Instead, we'll tell you the story behind the story. The story of Bernstein and Bob Woodward is one of persistence. When the 5 burglars initially broke in, they held $2,300 in cash, raising the journalists' suspicions. After learning of connections to the CIA, the story seemed larger than just a hotel burglary. Some of the burglars' address books included WH, or W House, increasing suspicions that the story connected to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Journalists can't rely on suspicions, though. As the story's first big break, Bernstein traveled to Florida, where the burglars were from. He found one burglar received a $25,000 check from Kenneth Dahlberg, the Midwest finance chairman for the committee to re-elect the president. That find gave credence and hard proof that the burglary went straight to the president. More importantly, it was something they could report on. After that, the story evolved into one increasingly difficult to report. The duo, dubbed Woodstein, searched phone books, airline tickets, building directories, hotel records, and even credit card records to no avail. Struggling to find sources, Woodward used an anonymous source, but would not even acknowledge his use. For his limitations on deep background, he earned his alias Deep Throat. One of Woodward's first notes from meeting Deep Throat encouraged him, "There is a way to untie the Watergate knot." Deep Throat kept the 2 reporters on the right track and focused on the true story of corruption. "I was thankful for any morsel of information, confirmation, or assistance Felt gave me while Carl and I were attempting to understand the many-headed monster of Watergate," Woodward wrote in a retrospective for the Washington Post. Because of his position virtually atop the chief investigative agency, his words and guidance had immense, at times even staggering authority. That information continued to impress and reassure executive editor of the Post, Ben Bradlee. Knowing his position meant Bradlee knew the paper was on the right track.
He was nudging and directing and pointing the reporters in one direction, in certain direction, rather than another. And that was the great value of Deep Throat.
Outside of the journalism world, Deep Throat was causing trouble.
People at the White House were bewildered by where this information was coming from. Stories were popping up on the front page of the Washington Post with great regularity that were just devastating and seemed to be extremely well sourced.
Deep Throat serves as one of the most infamous anonymous sources in history, in part because uncovering his existence raises moral questions. His existence remained unknown until the book Woodstein authored, All the President's Men, where Woodstein revealed a clandestine character they received information from. The Washington Post maintained they would not confirm the source's identity until his death, but 30 years after Nixon's resignation, former Deputy Director of the FBI, Mark Felt, confirmed he was Deep Throat. An ailing Felt showed his identity for financial prosperity and because of extreme familial pressures, much to Woodward's discomfort. But the discomfort for Felt started shortly after All the President's Men. It was obvious that the man providing such sophisticated and accurate information needed to be knowledgeable, leaving the source to a select few positions and much questioning.
You've denied a number of times being Deep Throat, but there remains in some of us the notion that maybe you were a piece of it, say a hunk of the larynx or something. And what I'm wondering is that whether you want to take credit at this time for helping unmask any of the Watergate cover-up.
No, I'm not Deep Throat, and the only thing I can say is that I wouldn't be ashamed to be, because I think whoever helped Woodward helped the country, no question.
With Felt, Woodstein bring one of their largest legacies, the proliferation of anonymous sources. Anonymous sources are frowned upon today, but they were much more so in decades past. Stories nowadays are filled with sources said, or a source close to the situation, and the list goes on and on. Headlines even feature the information provided by anonymous sources, something unheard of decades ago. That started with Woodstein. By starting that practice, the two gave anonymous sourcing immense credibility. It showed if you handle a source correctly, even an anonymous one, it can bring huge rewards. Aside from Woodward and Bernstein, the coverage of the Washington Post, specifically withstanding public pressure, was extraordinary. They published over 200 articles relating to Watergate, double the nearest publication, the New York Times. From first story of the break-in to last of Nixon resigning, Bradley put the stories on the front page, allowing for traction. Everyone would pick up the Post each morning and read the latest bombshell about Watergate, Marvin Cobb, a senior fellow at Harvard's Center on the Press, said. Cobb believes that the Post reporting was absolutely critical to creating an atmosphere in Washington and within the government that Nixon was in serious trouble and that the White House was engaged in a cover-up. The American Journalism Review concluded, what happened is that the press coverage played a very big role in making information available that the Watergate break-in was part of something vast and criminal. Media critic Ben Bagdikin credits Woodward and Bernstein with producing the single most spectacular act of serious journalism of the 20th century. However, some question that importance. Communication scholars Gladys and Kurt Lang admit that the press was a prime mover in the controversy only in its early phase. Watergate prosecutor Seymour Glanzer asserts the idea that they are this great investigative team was a bunch of baloney. By persevering and placing trust in an anonymous source, Woodward and Bernstein connected the dots to the White House. Other publications ridiculed them for not following the ongoing election, but Woodstein continued with the story. The Post enabled them with the adequate front-page real estate. As a prime mover in the controversy's early phase, Woodstein's initial reporting brought the issue to light and Nixon to the Senate. Nixon's resignation as a result of the Senate's hearings could only occur after the work and information found by Woodward and Bernstein. They alerted the judiciary and legislative branches, in the process establishing a fourth branch, the journalists. The two won a Pulitzer Prize, the highest annual journalistic award, and the George Polk Memorial Award for Outstanding Journalism, cementing the importance of their work. Watergate solidified the critical importance of investigative reporting, says Investigative Reporting and Editors Organization Executive Director Brant Houston. His very title is in part proof of Woodstein's legacy. The IRE was founded in 1975 to improve journalism across America, specifically that of investigative reporting like Woodward and Bernstein. Now, with over 5,500 reporters, that remains perhaps the only quantifiable aspect of their legacy. While the concept of a book as a culmination of journalistic work originated with muckrakers, the movie was unprecedented. Woodstein established themselves and journalists in general as celebrities. They made reporting sexy, bringing smarter people into journalism, though the global intelligence of reporters attributed to Woodstein is hard to measure. With their work, they romanticized and popularized the genre of investigative reporting. Reporters yearn for the biggest and juiciest undercover finds, namely with television shows like 60 Minutes. Whether journalism is in an entirely better place because of Woodward and Bernstein also remains inconclusive. Bringing smarter reporters, creating celebrity status, and to some extent expanding the field are all credits to Woodstein's byline. However, they were two unique reporters in a journalistic era gone by. With increasing competition to find the next scoop, journalism is a less nuanced game. When Woodstein played, it was a sophisticated sport. The demands of today's journalists that Woodstein inspired leads to more aggressive reporting in today's landscape. Woodward and Bernstein reporting in part also led to a public that increasingly distrusted the government. Former editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, Leonard Downey Jr., believes the relationship between the White House and the press was changed forever by Watergate. That proves true as an adversarial relationship between journalists and the White House continues to grow. To say it's caused by Woodstein would be a reach. To say they had no involvement, equally egregious. Their legacy lies somewhere in between, ultimately unquantifiable, but good enough for a story.